At 2 a.m. on June 20th, 1631, 237 people in Baltimore, Ireland, woke to screaming. North African corsairs were kicking down doors, dragging families from beds, chaining them in burning streets. By sunrise, every single one was on a ship to Algeria. Among them, Joan Broadbrook, a young woman who'd never left her village. 3 weeks later, she stood on a platform in an Algiers slave market. Buyers circled, squeezing her arms, examining her body like livestock. She was worth 8 oxen, less than a good horse. Joan wasn't unique. Between 1530 and 1780, over 1 million Europeans were captured and enslaved across North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Spanish, Italian, French, Icelandic, Irish. This is the story Europe chose to forget. That's what no one wants you to know. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the like button. This channel uncovers the brutal stories that history buried. The Barbary corsairs weren't random pirates. They were state-sponsored raiders operating from Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Salé, backed directly by the Ottoman Empire. Every slave sold meant tax revenue for the Sultan. This wasn't piracy. This was industry. Their fleets, sometimes 30 ships at once, attacked at night or dawn, when villages were defenseless. They took gold, silver, food. But their primary target was always people, because humans could be sold repeatedly. To these corsairs, you weren't human. You were inventory. A renewable resource to be captured, sold, used, and resold until nothing remained. In 1627, they reached Iceland, 400 people captured from Europe's northernmost point. Imagine an Icelandic farmer waking to men speaking Arabic, breaking down his door. Men from a continent he couldn't locate on a map. In 1544, Corsair Hayreddin Barbarossa raided the Italian coast and captured 7,000 people in one summer. Not a raid, a harvest. In 1554, Corsairs attacked Vieste, Spain, and took 6,000 captives. They emptied the entire town overnight. These weren't random attacks. They were coordinated military operations targeting specific demographics. Young women and children who brought the highest market prices. Imagine living on Spain's or Italy's coast during this period. Every night wondering if tonight was the night. If you'd wake to screaming. If by morning you'd be chained on a ship, heading to a world beyond imagination. For 250 years, that was reality. Entire coastal villages were abandoned. People moved inland, away from the corsairs' reach. Watchtowers lined every Mediterranean coast to spot incoming ships. Churches rang warning bells, but warnings weren't always enough. The corsairs adapted. They learned which villages had weak defences, bribed local criminals for intelligence, waited for storms that trapped fishing boats in harbour. Then they struck. Some Europeans, called renegades, actually converted and joined them. They knew European languages, customs, weaknesses. They became raid guides. The most famous, Simon the Dancer, a Dutch captain who switched sides and became one of Algiers' richest corsairs. He personally captured thousands of his own countrymen and sold them in markets. Money has no loyalty. Meet Maria Teralen, Dutch, captured in 1731 at age 22 while travelling on a merchant ship near Spain's coast. Pirates boarded at dawn. Men over 40, useless for labour, useless for sale, were thrown overboard. Young men were chained. All women were chained. The ship turned south. Maria spent 17 days in the cargo hold, chained with 40 other women. The space was so tight they couldn't lie down. They sat hunched in complete darkness. The smell, vomit, urine, fear itself, no light, no fresh air. Just the ship creaking and women crying in foreign languages. Some women died during the crossing. Their bodies were unchained and dragged to deck. Maria heard 7 splashes during those 17 days. 7 women who'd never see land again. One woman beside her stopped eating on day 3, stopped drinking on day 5. By day 8, she was gone. Maria sat chained to her corpse for hours before the slavers noticed and removed it. When they finally reached Algiers, they pulled her to deck. She hadn't seen sunlight in over 2 weeks. The light felt like needles in her eyes. The first thing she saw when her vision cleared, Algiers' white walls gleaming in the sun. The second, the slave market. The process was brutally efficient. Captives were taken to public baths, washed, wounds treated just enough to prevent death before sale. Then they were sorted like cattle. Strong young men went to manual labour or galleys, rowing ships until their bodies gave out. Most galley slaves died within 5 years, chained to oars, unable to move, fed just enough to keep rowing. Educated men were sold as tutors or craftsmen. More valuable, better treated, but still property. Children were trained as servants. Sometimes young ones were converted and raised in a new faith. They'd grow up never knowing where they came from, never knowing their real names. Women over 35 went to domestic work, cooking, cleaning, the invisible labour of wealthy households. But young women aged 15 to 30 were the most valuable merchandise in the entire market. They were destined for harems. Before sale came inspection. Women were taken to an elevated platform in the market centre. Potential buyers walked around examining them, squeezing arms and legs to check strength, pulling open mouths to inspect teeth, examining every inch of skin for diseases or defects. In many markets, especially Algiers and Tunis, women were put on full display for inspection. Nothing hidden, nothing left to imagination. Buyers ran their hands over bodies that didn't belong to them, touched whatever they wanted. French friar Pierre Dain worked rescuing Christian captives in Algiers in 1634. He documented what he witnessed, writing that Christian women were displayed in public squares, inspected like animals. Buyers touched them everywhere to verify health. Young women cried, but resistance met immediate beatings. Slavers struck them until they learned resistance was useless. This wasn't hidden. It happened in broad daylight, in public squares, witnessed by thousands. Completely legal, completely accepted. Now imagine Joan Broadbrook on that platform. A young woman from a tiny Irish village where she knew everyone by name, where her biggest worry was harvest quality, where she'd never been touched by any man. Now strangers, speaking incomprehensible languages, were examining her. Their hands on her body, their eyes evaluating her worth. She was sold to a Turkish merchant named Ahmed for the price of 8 oxen. She had no idea what that meant. No idea Ahmed already owned 7 other slaves. No idea her life as she knew it was over forever. The journey from Algiers to Istanbul took 6 weeks. Joan was kept in another ship's cargo hold with 20 other European women, Italians, Spanish, French, Greek. None spoke English. Communication was impossible, but fear needed no translation. They all knew what awaited them. They'd heard the stories. Women who'd survived tried to explain with gestures what to expect. Their hands mimed things words couldn't carry. When they arrived in Istanbul, they were taken directly to Ahmed's house. Other slaves immediately took Joan. They removed her European clothes and burned them. Everything from her old life gone in smoke. They bathed her in perfume water, dressed her in Ottoman clothing. She didn't recognize herself. That night, Ahmed visited her room. Joan had never been with a man. Never been alone with a man who wasn't family. In her village, such things happened after marriage. With someone you chose, someone who spoke your language and knew your name. Ahmed spoke no English. He didn't need to. Years later, Joan managed to send a letter to her family in Ireland, one of the only first-hand accounts from a captured Irish woman. In it, she wrote that she could not describe what she suffered that first night, only that she wished for death 1,000 times. But death did not come, and every night after was the same. That was harem reality, not silk cushions and perfumed gardens, not the romantic paintings European artists created without ever seeing what they painted, not exotic luxury, captivity, forced submission, survival, and the psychological torture of knowing this was forever. No rescue coming, no army marching to save them, no hope of seeing home again. Just endless days turning into endless years. Some women went mad. They screamed at walls, talked to people who weren't there. Other slaves would restrain them until they exhausted themselves. The ones who couldn't be controlled were sold or simply disappeared. Others found ways to survive inside their own minds. They created routines, small rituals, giving structure to formless days. They remembered songs from home, recipes their mothers made, the sound of rain on thatched roofs, anything to hold on to who they'd been. But most simply went numb. It was easier that way. Daily life depended entirely on the owner, but patterns were universal. First, constant pressure to convert. Conversion didn't grant freedom, they remained property, but it slightly improved household status. Those who resisted were punished with beatings, food deprivation, isolation in dark rooms for weeks. Second, forced language learning, Turkish or Arabic depending on location. Those who learned quickly received slightly better treatment. Those who couldn't or wouldn't were considered stubborn, rebellious. They were punished more severely until they learned or broke. Third and crucial, no European slave had legal rights. She couldn't testify in court, couldn't own property, couldn't refuse her owner anything, couldn't leave the house without permission. She was, in every legal sense, an object, a thing. Property with no more rights than furniture. Most ended up in one of three situations: brutal domestic work, cleaning, cooking, childcare, 16-hour days with no rest, frequent punishments for minor mistakes. A burned meal could mean a beating. A broken dish could mean no food for days. These women rarely saw outside the house. They aged rapidly. When they could no longer work, they were sold to poorer buyers or abandoned in the streets. Concubinage. If young and attractive, her owner used her whenever he wanted. In wealthy households with multiple concubines, they competed for attention and favours. If a concubine bore a son, her status improved. She might gain small freedoms, but daughters were worth less. Too many failures meant being sold or demoted to domestic work. Resale. Many slaves were bought and sold multiple times throughout their lives. Each sale was new trauma, new public inspection, new owner, new demands, new cruelties to learn. Some women were sold 5, 6, even 10 times. Every sale meant starting over. But one destination was feared above all: the imperial harem of the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. The harem wasn't a single building. It was a massive complex inside Topkapi Palace. Over 400 rooms, courtyards, baths, kitchens, gardens. At its peak, it held 500 to 1,000 women simultaneously. A city of women, all property. Most weren't European. They were Circassian and Georgian slaves from the Caucasus region, considered most beautiful by Ottoman standards. But Europeans were present, a rare and valuable minority. To reach the imperial harem, a slave had to be extraordinarily beautiful, young, usually 12 to 18, and survive a brutal selection process. The Sultan's agents roamed slave markets across the Ottoman Empire searching for candidates. They bought the most promising and brought them to the palace for additional evaluation. Physical inspection that made public markets look gentle, tests of temperament, learning ability, health, ability to please. Most were rejected and sold to other buyers. Only a small percentage was accepted into the harem. Once inside, training began, lasting years. New slaves learned Turkish, Ottoman etiquette, music, dance, embroidery, calligraphy. They were taught how to walk, speak, look at a man, look away. The goal: transform them into refined companions worthy of the Sultan. But here's the brutal truth shattering every fantasy about the harem. Of the 500 to 1,000 women living there, only a small fraction, maybe 50 to 100, would ever see the Sultan in person. And of those, only a handful, maybe 5 to 10 in an entire generation, would actually spend a night with him. The rest lived in permanent limbo, not free, but not serving the purpose for which they were captured. They spent years, sometimes decades, waiting for a summons that never came, growing older in gilded rooms, watching their beauty fade, knowing that with each passing year, their chances decreased. When a sultan died, all women who hadn't borne his children were transferred to the old palace, a separate complex where they lived the rest of their lives in even greater isolation. They never left, never married, never had children. They simply existed behind walls until death. Ottoman records mention a European slave identified only as Francesca. She entered the harem in 1650 at age 15. She died there in 1702 at 67, 52 years inside those walls. She never saw the Sultan, not once, never left the complex. Her only function for 5 decades, serving women of higher rank. When she died, she was buried in a cemetery for palace slaves. No name on the grave, only a number. Administrative records listed her as slave number 847. Origin, France. Status, deceased. Cause, advanced age. 52 years reduced to a number and 2 words. That was imperial harem reality, not power and luxury. A gilded prison where thousands of women disappeared without leaving any trace except a number in a ledger. So why did Europe allow this for 250 years? The answer is shameful. Europe was divided and weak. Religious wars between Catholics and Protestants consumed every resource. States didn't cooperate against the Corsair threat because they were too busy fighting each other. Some European states, especially Venice and France, had profitable trade agreements with the Ottoman Empire. They didn't want to risk those relationships over captured peasants and fishermen, and some Europeans profited from the system. Renegades served as corsairs and got rich. Merchants traded goods with North Africa, regardless of origin. Ransoming captives became its own industry. But the ransom system was slow, bureaucratic, and favoured the wealthy. A rich merchant's daughter might be rescued within a year. A poor fisherman's wife might wait forever. Most waited forever. Maria Terolan was one of the lucky ones. After 8 years in captivity, her family sold everything they owned to raise the ransom. 200 Dutch florins, a fortune for a working-class family. She was freed in 1739 and returned to Holland. But when she arrived, she discovered something devastating. Her fiancé had married another woman. Her mother had died of grief 2 years after her capture. Her father was financially ruined from raising the ransom, and her community rejected her. They saw her as contaminated, dishonored. No one wanted to marry a woman who'd been a slave. The assumptions about what had happened to her, true or not, marked her forever. Maria lived the rest of her life alone, working as a seamstress. In her diary, preserved in Dutch archives, she wrote that she would have preferred to die in captivity than return to this life. At least there her shame was private. Here it was public and eternal. The situation only changed in the 19th century when France began bombing Corsair bases. In 1830, they invaded Algeria and ended the system for good. But by then, over 1 million people had been captured. The vast majority never returned. Joan Broadbrook spent years in captivity. When finally freed, she tried returning to Ireland, but Baltimore was gone. Her home, her life, her family, all erased. Her family in Ireland never knew what happened to her. For decades, her name was read in Baltimore's church during prayers for captives. Every Sunday, her name spoken aloud. Every Sunday, no answer. Eventually, they stopped reading it. She was forgotten. This isn't just Joan's story, or Maria's, or Francesca's. It's the story of over 1 million European women whose lives were stolen by a human trafficking system that operated openly for centuries. The coasts of Ireland still remember the night of 1631. The archives of Istanbul still hold the slaves' names, and now you remember too. Every civilization has dark chapters like this one, stories buried and waiting to be told. Which culture should we explore next? Let me know in the comments.